Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the African American Heritage House and the 2021 CHQ Assembly. My name is Errol Davis, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as president of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to the 6th of 10 lectures that we will sponsor or co-sponsor this season. We are a diverse support organization which is informed by the African American experience. We're committed, of course, to strengthening Chautauqua, but we do this in a variety of ways, by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity, by fostering honest conversations such as the Mirror Project, and by adding robust new voices to the programmatic mix. Our focus over the last few years has been primarily on getting the narrative correct. Our view at the AAHH is that we must get the history correct, to get the understandings correct, to get the future relationships correct. It is important that we own both our past as well as our present. Thus, we are committed. We're committed to telling the stories that need to be told, primarily from the perspective of historically marginalized people. I encourage all of our viewers to visit our website, aaheritagehouse.org, to learn how you can support and even become involved in our work. As we are entirely supported by contributions, I also want to thank our many friends and supporters for making both last season as well as this season possible. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, we would be unable to bring the quality speakers to Chautauqua that we have over the years and are certainly doing so again this season. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this work. As you know, this week's thematic focus at Chautauqua is on building a culture of empathy. Our speaker today is Wes Moore. He is a combat veteran, a best-selling author, a small business owner, the former CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, and most recently a Democratic candidate for the governor of Maryland. He was born and raised in Baltimore and the Bronx, where his family moved after his father died when he was only 3 years old. Despite childhood challenges, he graduated with an associate degree from Valley Forge Military College and later graduated from Johns Hopkins University while becoming its very first Black Rhodes Scholar. Wes went on to serve as a captain and paratrooper with the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division, including a combat deployment to Afghanistan. He later served as a White House Fellow, advising on issues of national security and international relations. Before becoming CEO at Robin Hood, Wes was the founder and CEO at Bridge EdU, an education platform based in Baltimore addressing the college completion and job placement crisis. They do this by reinventing the freshman year for underserved students. He is the best-selling author, as we all know, of the other Wes Moore, The Work, and 5 Days, the story of the uprisings in Baltimore in 2015, following the killing of Freddie Gray while in police custody. Because of Wes's rather hectic schedule, he's unable to be with us live, and thus will be unable to respond to our viewers' questions. To aid in the interview process, however, I am joined today by a fellow board member, Ernie Mahaffey, who, like Wes and me, is a veteran of the U.S. military. Ernie will call on both his military and small business background to enrich the interview experience. This entire program was recorded earlier in the week, but I hope you find it both enjoyable and enlightening nonetheless. My fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased to present to you, Wes Moore.
Hi, my name is Wes Moore, and I am absolutely thrilled to have the chance to talk a little bit today about the spirit of empathy. And first, I want to start off with the fact that there is a difference between sympathy and empathy. Sometimes people conflate them. Sometimes people think those words can be used interchangeably. They can't, because actually they come from a very different basis. Sympathy is I feel a certain type of way or I do something because I feel bad for you. Empathy is your pain is mine. And so the way I respond, the speed and the heart in which I react is fundamentally different. And we want to live as a society in a spirit of empathy. to know the things that are hurting others should hurt us too. The things that are impacting others' future impact ours as well. And the measures of inequity that we have within our society, that's not their problem. That's all of our problem. And we have to move accordingly. You know, my grandfather was the first black minister in the history of the Dutch Reformed Church. In fact, he was the first one on my mom's side of the family that was born in the United States. My great-grandfather was a minister, and he was a vocal minister. He was a minister who understood that his job was not just to teach the Word of God, but his job was to remind people that the Word of God was not being lived by everybody here on earth. And when my grandfather was born in South Carolina, to my great-grandfather, who was his vocal minister, very early in his life, in fact, some of his earliest memories of his life, was when they started getting threats. First starting with verbal threats, but eventually turning into very physical threats, where to the point that in the middle of the night, my great-grandfather had to pick up his family, to include his toddler son, and leave. They didn't just leave South Carolina. They left the United States. And it was the Ku Klux Klan that ran my family out. They went back to Jamaica with the vast majority of my family making the pledge that they would never return to this country. And most of them did not. Never stepped foot back in the United States. Except for my grandfather. My grandfather always felt that he was born here. This was his birth home. He was as American as anybody else. And no one had the right to take that away from him. So eventually he came back to the U.S. He went to Lincoln University, which is an HBCU in Pennsylvania. Got his doctorate degree. Became a minister and eventually became the first black minister in the history of a church. I think about him often as I go through my own journeys. He's a man who passed away at 87 years old. He actually passed away when I was just coming back from Afghanistan. And I remember how he always used to talk about his passion for this country and his passion for the people here. Now understand, this is a man who had a deep Jamaican accent his entire life. And very proud deep Jamaican accent his entire life. But still was maybe one of the most American people that I've ever met. Still was one of the people who I think believed in the tenet and the promise of this nation in a way that someone like I've never met before. And right before I went off to Afghanistan, actually, he gave me a Bible. It was a little small pocket Bible that could fit inside our flak vests when we went on missions and we went on deployments. And inside the Bible, he just wrote 4 words, and the words just simply said, "Have faith, not fear." And I used to say that over and over and over again before I went on any missions. Have faith, not fear. Have faith, not fear. Have faith, not fear. I am completely convinced that those 4 words, that mantra, that repetitiveness, it helped to guide me on every single mission that I went on. To the point that I still say it to this day. And so I think about what that means now in this moment, this idea of having faith, not fear. Where the reality is that living with a spirit of empathy, it's complicated, it's hard, it's difficult, it's vulnerable, it's compromising. This idea of being able to live with a unity and an understanding of one, a unity and an understanding that everything we do is interconnected. An ability and a belief to also understand that unless we all win, none of us do. Have faith, not fear. Because in this moment, it is that spirit of empathy that's going to get us through. We have seen clearly how inequality shows itself. We have seen clearly that we still have structures and systems within our society right now that is making opportunity readily available for some and dangerously absent for others. We also have to see and understand that in this moment and in this time, we actually have a chance to do something about that. If we're willing to lead with a spirit of empathy. And so as we move forward, as we think about what these next steps will bring for all of us, I just ask that we remember the words of Reverend Dr. James Joshua Thomas, my grandfather, who fundamentally understood that in the times of our greatest depth, in the times of our greatest darkness, in a time when every fundamental question is being asked of us, that we just remember the simple rule of have faith, not fear. Bless y'all. Thank you.
Wes, thank you for those really enlightening comments. We're going to talk quite a bit about empathy here today as we looked at who should be our speaker during a week on empathy. Your name, of course, came up instantly because so many people associate your name with the topic of empathy. And so in your book, The Other Wes Moore, you indeed exemplified the notion of empathy. Why did you pursue this, and what did you learn in connecting with the other Wes Moore?
I really do, and I think it was that process that really helped me to really fully appreciate the difference between, sympathy and empathy in that way, right? Where this idea that sympathy really is that I'm doing it because I feel bad for you. Empathy is I'm doing it because your pain is mine, right? And I think that this idea and this venture into empathetic love really became very clear to me through this journey with the other Wes Moore. An empathetic understanding. Because when you are just so deeply reminded about how thin that line is between lives, about how singular decisions can really help determine which place people go and which places they don't go, and how in many cases those singular decisions are not based on the individual, that many of them are decisions that are made on their behalf, that are made for them. And then it helps to dictate and decide which lanes and avenues of approach they actually still have available. And so I think it was something that was really important for me to kind of to go through and experience it and to see it firsthand. Where, when people would say, well, what was the thing that kind of helped determine why your life went one way or Wes's life went one way or this or that? And the reality is that you realize there is no one singular thing per se, right? That there's almost this measure of a daisy chain that all of our lives end up enduring and end up seeing and end up building through. And I think with that though, that's when that nuance, that's when that build, that's when that frame is something that I think has to be kind of fully comprehended and understood, that it is a very thin line between where we are and then where we actually hope to be in many cases, what we even know is available in other cases, and what options are then left available to us.
Thank you.
Yes, Wes, thank you for that inspiring introduction. When you were here on the stage, you said some things to a session of young males. You met with a session of young males, and you were asked, how do you develop empathy? And do you think it's harder to teach men about empathy than women, say your daughter? And any comments you'd have along those lines?
I don't think it's harder to teach empathy to a group of boys versus a group of girls. I do think that there are certain nuances though that I know, like for example, for me as I was coming up, that I know that there were a whole lot of things that my mom taught me and could teach me and could help me with. I also know that the absence of my father mattered. That there were a whole lot of things that my mom filled in the gap of. But there were just certain nuances of what it meant to grow up. For example, in my case, to grow up as a young Black male in Baltimore or New York or in this country, there are certain nuances that my mom didn't understand because she never experienced it. And it's the same thing, frankly, where there's just going to be certain nuances that my daughter will have to see and experience as she's coming up. And, I plan on, providing her with every single support and guidance and advice that I can. But there will be certain nuances of what it means to grow up as a young woman that I just don't have a frame. I don't have a reference to that my wife or my mom or my sisters or her friends or my mom-in-law, whoever it is, they will have a unique perspective to be able to give her that I know for me would just be much more complicated for me to give that understanding, right? So I don't think it's more difficult to teach measures of empathy. I think that our young boys and our young girls and they will all process that is as how they process. I do think that and for me, there were people who were able to step into my life, and there were males who were able to step into my life. In no way, shape, or form were they ever trying to replace my father or fill the void, but they were there to be able to help give a certain level of support to my mom that I know that in many cases she needed.
Thank you. We are, and as we all know, a deeply divided nation at the moment. And given your family history and what you said about your grandfather and leaving the country and coming back, were you surprised? Are you still surprised? Or are you surprised that we're a deeply divided nation? And obviously, you've accepted this divide because you've decided that you want to work to solve it. Give me your view on that. Is it surprising to you that we still are as divided as we are?
It's not surprising, and it's not surprising for a few reasons. First of all, it's not surprising when you just think of the scope and the scale of this country, right? We are a massive nation, a nation of 300 plus million people, and the histories, the cultures, the references that are taking place in Alaska are going to be different than what are taking place in Nebraska. What's taking place in Maine is going to be different than what's taking place in Maryland. What's taking place in Florida is going to be different than what's taking place in Arizona, right? So we are such a big nation that an understanding of kind of our differences and that type of thing it's not surprising for the fact that you do have people who can spend much of their life in their neighborhood, in their cocoon, talking to their friends and people who come up in areas just like them. So when a person is coming talking about another area, it's not even that they don't understand. There's not even the context to be able to understand because you have people who just they are they know what they know. I'm a person the same way. I know what I know, right? In many cases, it was actually why the military was such an important training ground and lesson for me, because it forced me to live in places I would have never lived. I would have never spent time, and I had no reason to spend time in, Fort Leonard Wood or Fort Lewis or Fort Benning or Fort. I would have had no context to go spend time in Columbus, Georgia. I would have had no context to go spend time in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I would have no context so it forced me to get out of a comfort zone. It forced me to see different parts of the country. It forced me to get to know people who come from different parts of the country. And so I feel like it was something that became really helpful when it gave a sense of context for how I had to think about and view the world. Now, there is another point though. that when I think about the divides that this country has, that I think this country does need to wrestle with. And I think it is the fact that there is so much about our own history that many people in this country do not know. There's so much about our journey that many people don't have a context of. And that becomes complicated because, one, because of, these are things that our entire country should have a sense of context about, right? The second thing is that there are nations that have had the courage to be able to look at its deepest wounds and know that in order for us to move forward, it means we have to have a collective understanding of how we got here. Right? On a collection of different fronts, whether you're talking about a truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, or what took place in Rwanda, what took place in Burundi, the process that took place in Germany, the process that took place in Northern Ireland, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Chile, in Canada, twice, right? So these are countries that had the courage to be able to look in some of their deepest wounds and to be able to say, in order for us to really move forward, we have to understand how we got here. And truthfully, it's not something that the United States has had a process, has not gone through that process of doing. And so I think that many of these divides take place both because of a lack of connection to one another, right? It's easy to demonize someone who I don't know. Much more difficult to demonize someone who I know their family, I know their kids, I know their parents. It's much more difficult for me to demonize them. Right? The other thing is, it's much more difficult to demonize when I understand our histories, and I appreciate our histories, the interconnectedness of our histories. And I think those are things that do become very important in order for us to properly move on and be able to erase many of these divides and the schisms that exist, is our ability to be able to understand our joint history and our joint interactions with a sense of honesty and with a sense of frankly, with a sense of vulnerability about what that means.
Well, we in the AAHH, of course, couldn't agree with you more. Our view, as I stated in the opening, is that we want to get the narrative correct. In order to do that, we present speaker after speaker to provide a historical context. Because if you can't get the narrative correct, you can't get understanding. And if you don't have understanding, you won't get the relationship correct. But you also mentioned that other countries have had the courage, and you, of course, politely didn't say that we don't have the courage. But as I look out, I see a common core in math, a common core in science, and chaos in history. And so, again, you have political aspirations, and so I'm going to let my colleague ask some questions about politics.
Thank you very much. So but it does lead very well into that. I mean, you're obviously in a bully pulpit now, and you're teaching as you campaign. How effective, really, do you think you can be in explaining these kinds of concepts on the campaign trail?
Yeah. Well, I think the simple answer is time will tell, right? I think the simple answer is that we'll know in about a year kind of how effective that we were. I think the thing that I know is it's exactly how I plan on campaigning, because it's who I am. When I think about every single task and platform that we've been able to have, and every place that I've been able to lead in, I've had to try to lead just by being my most authentic self. Whether it was leading soldiers in combat, whether it was starting a successful business, whether it was leading one of the largest nonprofits in this country, there are certain threads to how my leadership had to show itself. And one of the threads that I think the way my leadership had to show itself was just coming up with this real form of just transparency and honesty. And I think with part of that, it does mean a measure of education. And people will tell you that, to win in politics, you have to have it all down in 3 words. And, You have to have it down in 4 seconds. That's the attention span. I'm sure there's some truth to that. The thing that I know, though, is that there's a nature of complexity that our history, that our history conjures, that I think that the current conversation justifies. And frankly, there's a beauty in what we can actually get done if we can figure this out, that I think oftentimes the current conversation minimizes. And so I feel like that's part of our job, right? Part of our job is to make sure that everyone understands a sense of collective, connectivity to the issues we're talking about, to the things we're trying to get done. And at the same time, this provides us a unique moment to really think about the type of issues, the type of policies we want to put in place, the type of things that we want to see as fabrics within our society that we just know have been long overdue in terms of the larger conversation.
Thank you. One of the things that we always try to do, of course, whenever we're talking with intelligent people, is to get advice from them. And so I'm going to seek some on behalf of the Chautauqua Institution itself. We have also suggested at times they need advice, but I'm going to let it come from you. We're in the midst here at Chautauqua of a very important campaign, and one of those goals of the Capitol campaign is to extend the impact of Chautauqua beyond the gates of Chautauqua. And you've had the opportunity to be here a number of times, and so I'm not going to suggest you are the ultimate expert on Chautauqua, but what do you see as the unique aspects of Chautauqua, and what does this community need to do to be more relevant in the future?
First, I think the unique elements for Chautauqua, I think that there isn't a single theme that is preached at Chautauqua. I think that every theme is challenged. And I think there's a beauty to that, right? Where I think people come to Chautauqua, they come, and I know it's every experience I've ever had. It's not like we're being told what to think. We're just being asked to think, right? We're being asked to bring yourself, your background, your history, your readings, your knowledge, your understandings, your perspectives, and to know that what's going to happen during this week is you're not coming here to be validated. Right? You're coming here to be challenged, to be pushed, to be immersed. And then from there, you do with that what you will. And I think there's a certain beauty of that I think, not just that Chautauqua provides, but I know it's something that I've experienced, the entire time. And the other thing that's really interesting about Chautauqua is, it's the type of thing where a person could come and go to every single session. A person could come and go to none. A person could come and spend the entire time listening to wonderful music and orchestras. And a person could come and say, I only want to go to hear the sermons. A person could come and say, I want to spend time on the water all day. And a person could come and say, I just want to spend time in the dining halls and just have amazing conversations over breakfast and lunch and dinner. I mean, there really is a choose your own adventure platform for Chautauqua, which I think is really powerful. And also I think it's very American in that way, right? Where there's a beauty in this idea of we all have our own roads to choose which way we go, which one we take. Maybe halfway through you decide to turn and you want to do something else, and that's fine. But there's this natural feeling that whichever path you choose is the correct path because it's yours. And that is something I think that's really powerful about the entire experience.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to drag us back to empathy. You've been in various positions in your career, And what does to have an empathetic culture mean to you?
I think having an empathetic culture just simply means that we have a culture that goes above and beyond to understand what the perspectives of others might be. And that we'll be intentional about it, that we check ourselves on it, that with every decision that we make, that one of the final checkpoints, one of the final markers that we look at, that we understand when we're going through this is you say, what's the counter argument? How would someone else feel? If they are not in this room advocating for themselves, what do we think that argument would actually be? And so I think the idea of being an empathetic society just simply means who has a place at the table and whose voice is being heard. And then as leaders, as managers, as activists in this work, that part of the job then becomes making sure that when these things are being made, that you actually have impacted populations that are being not just represented, but are being thought about, even in conversations. Because I feel like that is part of the difficulty of policy, and that's part of the difficulty that we have so much to work, is it's the people who these conversations most impact are oftentimes not at the table when the decisions are being made. Right. And so when these things happen, or when the decision goes down, and even when people, when people are upset about it, whatever the case might be, it's like there's this moment of shock, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that the blowback would be so severe. Yeah, because the impact of populations weren't at the table. And had they been, there probably would have been some feedback to say, understand, this is probably coming when this decision is made, and here's why, right? So I think part of the way we have to do it within our own collective society is by just being amazingly and remarkably intentional about who was at the table and why. Because there's a line we actually have in Robin Hood where it said the people who are closest to the challenge are oftentimes the ones who are closest to the solution. They're just hardly ever at the table. And that's the type of thing that I think that's where empathy cuts in, and where empathy really does serve as a core foundational pillar of how we should center our leadership.
I'm going to move you just a little bit away from empathy, but stay on the topic of leadership. I talk to ex-military people all the time, and they usually sing a somewhat similar song. They say, I'm glad I went in, I learned a lot, it has served me well, I maybe don't want to do it again. And so the question I would ask about your service in the Army is, what do you, or did you, take away from your service, and how do you apply that in your current work, in your current leadership roles?
It's one of the things that I loved about the military, and I got so much out of it, when people said, well, what was it that really gave you kind of leg up? Like, was it the discipline? The push-ups and the waking up early and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, like I told you, it was like, I mean, that's a given, right? Yes, you're going to do a lot of push-ups. I mean, you're going to wake up early. I mean, that's kind of like the low-hanging fruits. That's the nature of the work, right? But that wasn't my takeaway. The biggest takeaway I actually had was actually that it was the leadership. It was that the military, for generations, really has a pretty patented model on how they actually introduce leadership into the lives of the individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen. And it's a process where they're going to start you off with something small, and then there's this graduated sense of responsibility where every single year or 2 years, you continue to gain a little bit more responsibility, and you gain a little bit more responsibility, and you gain a little bit more responsibility, where they're going to put you in charge of a team first, then it's a squad, then it's a platoon, then it's a company, then it's a battalion. So it's like there's a natural trend of leadership graduation that I think takes place. And all throughout that time, they teach you basic tenets that whether you are a platoon leader or whether you are a battalion commander, whether you are a squad leader or whether you are a first sergeant, there's skills that carry you throughout that, right? Skills like you must be technically competent. We're not asking you to be an expert in everything, but you must be technically competent in everything. Because you cannot lead an organization if you have no idea what that organization does. And again, it's not saying you're an expert. You will have experts around you on certain aspects and certain elements, but you must be technically competent. You know, you must be able to outwork everyone on your team, and you can never ask someone to do something that you would not be willing to do yourself. You must make sure that you build the best team humanly possible. That in many cases, when I look at leaders, I actually don't need to look very much at the leader. The first question I always ask is, who do they have around them? Because that'll tell me everything about that leader. How secure they are, what their vision is, what they prioritize. Just by tell me about your team. And people who make sure they take care of their people. Right? Because one thing I'm a big believer of is leaders who take care of their people have a way of taking care of them. Not one of us as a leader are perfect. Every single one of us have soft tissue parts. Every one of us have areas that we need to make sure we have coverage on. If you take care of your people, the world will never know. Because they will make sure that the world doesn't need to know that because they've got you. They know you've got them, they've got you. The moment that you get a person and you get a leader who does not take care of their people, it's amazing how quickly their organization will watch that person crash and burn because they've got it. They don't need us. So there's certain basic tenets of leadership that I've tried to apply to everything that I go in, every position I've gone to, every role that I've taken on, that the military was really my training ground. And it has helped me and forged me in that really powerful, important way.
Appreciate that answer. Let me
Yeah,
move
so-
from the military to philanthropy a little bit.
Yeah, so this is maybe sectoral leadership or whatever you might call it, but you've had experience in small business and in philanthropy, not to mention the Army, of course. But so you've been very clear that philanthropy cannot solve systemic problems on its own. Can you talk about philanthropy's role in creating progress?
Yeah, I think philanthropy has a really important role because there's certain uniqueness to philanthropy. One, I think philanthropy has to understand why it exists. Right? Philanthropy exists because there are holes that continue to allow people to fall through. Right? The reason that we fund so many housing philanthropies, right, or foundations, organizations, is because there are so many people who are housing insecure. Right? The reason we fund so many food organizations is because there are so many people who are food insecure. The reason we put so much money into education is because there are still people, even students that graduate, who will finish and not be prepared for college or careers. Right? So there's a reason why many nonprofit organizations exist, and the reason they exist is because we still have holes that are allowing people to fall through. So the power of the foundation world, the power of what we're able to do is we're able to have an understanding of that, and we have the beauty to be able to have a certain amount of capital and leverage that we can actually focus on ways to be able to address it. And there's a uniqueness that we can do where our philanthropy, and one thing we always said about our capital is our capital should be patient, but it shouldn't be permanent. We shouldn't become a line item. And the reason is because it behooves us to continue asking the question, why does that organization exist in the first place? That organization exists because we continue to have a hole in our social fabric that allows that organization to be a necessity, right? No matter what that organization focuses on, veterans, the environment, children, animals, whatever it is. The second thing is when we're talking about what is the uniqueness of the foundation world, is that we can actually be risk capital. we can invest in things early. We can invest in things before the government has the ability to invest in. I mean, something that we saw, with Robinhood, where Robinhood was able to, invest in things like needle exchanges before anyone would touch it, because needle exchanges were too controversial. When people said, "What do you mean you're going to give clean needles or give needles to drug users?" Well, if you looked at the data continued to show that when you had that rise and that massive kick up in HIV/AIDS, that much of that was a passage of dirty needles. Right. And so that's what the data continue to show us. And so we're, being a very data-driven organization, I call myself a very data-driven and heart-led leader. One thing that Robinhood did was that Robinhood said, fine, we'll invest in needle exchanges. And now Robinhood doesn't invest in needle exchanges. Nobody does. The reason is because the federal government does it. But the federal government was never going to be first money in.
Right. Nope.
The federal government was never going to have that appetite. That's where philanthropy came in, because we could fail and then tomorrow fail a little bit better, but know that with every single day we're getting closer to the answer. And that's the thing that I think philanthropy can also have a really unique role in helping us every day to get closer to the answer.
Yeah, let me stay on philanthropy a little bit. Like all other disciplines, it is not static. It is changing. And from your perspective, what are some of the innovations that excite you, that you see in philanthropy, particularly those that many of us might not know about, that have not been scaled yet, but might be coming down the pike? If you know about any of those, what should we be looking for in the future of philanthropy?
It's a good question. One is I think that the one thing that we are going to see within philanthropy, which is going to be really interesting, is it's the philanthropy of things that we are funding that we have no intention of funding for long, because we have every intention of working to bring the problem to government for them to fix it. Right. So, for example, we did something. We funded an initiative called iCare. What iCare is, it's an initiative that was providing legal assistance to undocumented children who found themselves in immigration court, because we found it abhorrent that you would literally have a 3-year-old who had to defend themselves in immigration court, because if a person's undocumented, they don't get the same legal rights to counsel that a person who is documented has in this country. And so we started funding this initiative called iCare. We helped to build it. Now iCare is stretched out and expanded. It's in multiple different states. Eventually, and we've already seen how laws are actually being altered and changed to be able to adapt, to be able to address that issue. It's one of the things I think is really powerful and exciting, because this is not about how are we making our issue that we're focusing on, how we make it, the challenge of it, more tolerable. It's about how we're using our capital to solve it. Mm-hmm. And so I think philanthropy's ability to work with government early, and to even say things like, listen, we'll fund it. We'll de-risk it. But what we're asking is that this thing, as we show that it works, that you now have the capacity and the ability and the will to be able to take it on and then bring it on to its next measure. That's the type of thing that I think makes me really excited.
Great.
Yeah, that's so. I love the idea of funding the risky part of something, or helping to trial something that you hope others will pick up, and it's really critical to get that commitment to pick up. Obviously, take you in a different direction altogether. A lot of us know about Baltimore. I was in the Army in Baltimore at a particular time, and but tell us about Baltimore, and tell us about Baltimore and Maryland. What's going on there, and what are you seeing that's of concern and for excitement?
Well, I think Baltimore is a place that it holds a very special place in my heart, because I think that Baltimore, in many ways, it epitomizes a great American story, and I think in many ways, so many of the joys of Baltimore and so many of the ills of Baltimore can be wrapped up in understanding the American story. The changing in economies, how we had a situation where the largest employer in Baltimore City, decades ago, was Bethlehem Steel, hardcore Rust Belt town. now the largest employer in Baltimore is by far Johns Hopkins University. Where when Bethlehem Steel was there, if you had a high school degree and a strong back, you had a job. Try getting a job at Johns Hopkins with a high school degree and a strong back, right? It's just a different economy. When you look at even the history of race inside of our society, where Baltimore, is a place that is remarkably hyper segregated, where things like redlining, Baltimore was the birthplace of redlining, literally where it started in the United States. And so you think about how all of these things build out and show themselves in sometimes really complicated and dangerous ways. Where if you look at the city of Baltimore right now, and I'm proud of the new leadership that we have on board, but the reality is that Baltimore has had 4 mayors in 5 years, has had 5 police commissioners in 5 years. So there's a measure of instability that I think that this new crop of leadership I think is really helping to take on, but it's something that the city really needs to identify. It is also one of the reasons why I know that, and even in my journey into looking at this, into the governor's race, where the Baltimore story will not be written by Baltimore alone. It will also be written by the state. It'll also be written by our neighbors. It'll be written by everybody. I mean, I think about the power of take a place like Detroit, for example, right? When Detroit had a slogan, Detroit versus everybody, Detroit versus everybody. It was, and they had a Super Bowl commercial with Clint Eastwood and Eminem, and talking about it's Detroit versus everybody. It was a great marketing campaign. It just wasn't true, right? Because it wasn't Detroit versus everybody. It was Detroit and the state of Michigan, which doubled down on figuring out ways of being able to support Detroit, and the federal government, who also came in to support the auto industry, and the private sector, and JP Morgan, who moved headquarters in Detroit. So there was this collective reimagination that I think was really powerful and interesting and exciting. And I think that's something when I think about the future of Baltimore is going to be a powerful American comeback story. I just think that there's going to be, and there need to be, more than just 600,000 authors of that story.
Let me get back, if I might, to the military here a little bit. We see a lot of movies about the military, and the portrayal of military leadership in those movies is often, the tough guy, the Patton, who doesn't particularly seem empathetic. And so, and people who do seem empathetic, at least in these movies, are labeled as soft a part of the time. And so, the question I have is empathy a real asset for military leadership, and how is it done in the military? And we're going to stay on this military theme for the next question as well.
I think empathy is an imperative thing for military leadership and for leadership as a whole. Because if you do not understand and remember who it is that you're supposed to be fighting for and what it is that you're supposed to be getting done, then you'll find yourself getting lost very quickly and feeling very stranded very quickly. I feel like empathy it's a tie that binds. And I feel like it is it's one of the core fabrics when we think about the type of thing that we want to be, the type of society that we want to build out, and the way that some of the things that we just want to hold true as a large society as well. So I think it's imperative.
You demonstrated empathy the last time you were at Chautauqua, last time I remember, and that was when you and General Petraeus did push-ups on the AMP stage. Do you recall that?
Oh, I recall it. I remember I was talking with General Petraeus beforehand when I told him if it's okay, I'd like to ask him to do it. And as we were talking, when I said, how many push-ups do you think you can do? And his answer was, 1 more than you. So I definitely recall it. And I definitely recall why. right? The reason
You
that
tell
we
us.
we did the push-ups, was because it was an acknowledgement of the fact that we, at that time saw 21 soldiers who were committing suicide veterans who were committing suicide every day. And so it was. I will never forget the moment, and also I will never forget the message.
Our military today, our military leaders are challenged by the polarization in this country. What is your assessment of how they're faring with this? I hear the head of the Joint Chiefs talking about driving, radicals out of the military, and we saw the military dragged into the situation of clearing civilian protesters away, which they admitted was a mistake. But what is your view of how our military leaders faring or doing today with in the process of addressing the polarization in our country?
Well, I think our military has a very difficult task, because I think one thing people have to remember with the United States military is, the United States military is made up of people in the United States. We're not robots, we're not creations. We're people who come from every town, every city, every rural area, every suburban area, every age. We're people who represent this country. And we're all then brought into this singular place. Now, just because we're brought into this singular place and we wear the same uniform and we learn the same nomenclature, doesn't mean that we're not bringing our histories. Doesn't mean we're not bringing our prejudices. Doesn't mean we're not bringing our experiences into that unique situation. And so I do think it is something that the military does have to wrestle with. The fact that there are people in the military who are bringing to the military an ideology or a belief system that might not be consistent with where our the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chiefs thinks that we should go as a military, where I think we should go as a military. And so I do think it's important that we are able to, both use the military as an additional training ground. And when I say training ground, it's not just where we learn how to conduct offensive maneuvers and how do we do infantry tactics, but a training ground is also about how do we continue to learn about our country and its histories and who we are and how we got here. And frankly, how we learn about the uniqueness of the role the military has played in it. Because the truth is, the military desegregated before society did, right? The military equal pay before society did. The military has had a greater balance of both entry level and mid level and even senior level leadership of people of color than society did. So it's this type of thing that I think that the military should also be proud of its history and the fact that there were so many tides of American society that the military took the lead on, and that it's actually our society that caught up. But that still doesn't mean that as a military leadership that we shouldn't be diligent about being able to continue to make our military more inclusive and better, but also that for those who do not have the best interest of the United States and that we need to root them out. And so it's a hard task. It's a challenging task. It's also, frankly, when I think about it as a task, that as a military that we have to have a 360 evaluation. And that also means being critical of ourselves. I mean, we still have military bases right now that are named after Confederate generals. Many of the bases that I served on, I think about Fort Bragg, right? Fort Bragg was named after Braxton Bragg, who was a Confederate general, who was a slave owner, and he wasn't a very good general either. He lost most of his battles. But this was who Fort Bragg is named after. And I don't think as a military, and it's one of the things I'm proud that the United States military is really going through this process. We've been thinking about both base realignments and base renamings, because that matters. It matters to people. It matters to our soldiers. It matters to our sailors and our airmen and our Marines and our Coast Guardsmen, right? So these are the type of things that I think it's good that the military continue to push itself to think differently and be better when it comes to the type of society that we're trying to lead on.
Well, I think that in terms of the military leading, I would agree with you there, although I would suggest that not all branches of the military led as quickly as the Army did. But we also
Fair point.
see the military again leading, I think, in putting the history on the table. Just this week, there was a memorial at Fort Benning, Georgia, again, a base named after a Confederate general for a soldier who was lynched in 1941. And so, the military is putting its history on the table, and that's a good thing. The other scary side of that coin may be when you have retired four-star generals talking about coup d'etats in this country, and I find that a little scary. But I'm assuming they don't have the troops under their command any longer, so I'm not going to worry too much about them. We need to get out of the military. We're going to wrap this up pretty quickly, and we're going to go back to some of your civilian activities, and so I will turn that over again to my colleague.
Well, it's I think of it as a blend of civilian and military. As you're on the campaign trail, you're going to face people who will say to you that military should never have been asked to do social engineering, and you'll hear all kinds of things. So how do you deal, as a civilian now, how do you deal with this polarization, up front and uncomfortably in our country?
It has been such a humbling experience even thus far, kind of going out on the campaign trail and talking to people about where they are and what their fears and their hopes and everything else is. And you're right. I mean, some of the conversations I walk away from enlightened, some I walk away from inspired, some I walk away from heartbroken, and some I walk away from them completely baffled, right? But that's the nature of the job and the nature of the work is that everyone's opinions is going to matter, just none too much, right? How do you keep all of that in context as you're trying to process all this information that you're then trying to understand and then think through? How then do you put yourself in the position to make the right choices, and not just particularly for for as large a population as you can, but also know and with an understanding that it's oftentimes the most vulnerable who are the ones that you need to make sure that you are that you're thinking about first and last in all this, because oftentimes they're their voices are not heard.
Absolutely.
And I think kind of so in context to the people who will come and challenge you on a whole bunch of different things. I think the beauty of it is that the beauty of this country is there is that right of freedom of speech. There is that right of people to be able to share their opinions. Our job is to try to make sure that those opinions are as informed as humanly possible, ours included, and to know that that as we're trying to move society into a different place, that we're never going to get 100% of it right or get 100% of the people on your side. We get it. You aim for it, you're always going to fall short. But as long as you can just stay consistent to your values and stay consistent to what it is you're trying to get done, you feel good about what it is you're then working towards and trying to accomplish.
Well, Wes, let me say that we have enjoyed this session tremendously. It is clear that we're going to run out of time before we run out of questions. But let me ask one last question, and I'm going to focus on your role and your experience at Robin Hood here, because there you were focused on fighting poverty. And so, and again, it's perhaps not a single point question, but a summary of your experiences there. What did you learn about what works well, and what were some of the things that you accomplished that you're most proud of, and some of the things you've tried, some of the innovations you've tried? And lastly, what do you think we have to do as a nation to change a lot of our systems based on your experiences at Robin Hood? And we won't abuse you anymore after you answer this question.
This is not abuse. I'm loving this. I think there are a lot of things I'm really proud of as an organization. During my time as CEO, It was the first time that Robinhood actually made investments and started doing work outside of New York. Robinhood, throughout its 32-year history, had really been a New York-focused organization, New York-born, New York-bred. But we really came in with a mentality that poverty is not a New York issue alone. And part of our responsibility is to try to make sure that we're taking best practices that we see from elsewhere and incorporating them into our work, and also taking the best practices we've learned and sharing them with others. And so really creating that core partnership with other places around the country, that became something that was incredibly important and something we were intentional and deliberate to really push towards. I think other things that I'm really proud of is that we created a policy for the first time in the history of the organization, because I didn't understand how we could talk about how we want to end poverty without understanding the role that adjusting public policy was going to have on that. Public policy, we have policies in place right now that are both putting people and keeping people in poverty. And so if we want to genuinely fight poverty, you have to be able to understand the policies that then have to be adjusted in order for us to be able to achieve that goal. And I'm proud of the fact that when we think about, we created participatory grant making for the first time, which was actually getting people who are living in poverty and having them being part of our grant making process. Wow. And again, it goes back to this idea of saying, when we say we want the experts to be able to identify what it is we're going to fund, who are the experts? It's not always just the person who has the PhD or the one who, wrote the amazing op-ed. Sometimes the people who have been living with this, oftentimes generationally, who can give us the greatest insights as to what we can do to be able to address this issue. And so I'm really proud of many of those initiatives that we're able to get done. But I do think, though, that, one of the big takeaways about how do we focus on it going forward is we realize there is not one single sector that has the responsibility of fixing this problem. It's not the nonprofit organizations, it's not foundations, it's not government, it's not business. It's all of us. That every single one of us have a role to play in terms of addressing an issue that should keep all of us up at night. And that interconnectedness of the work, the interconnectedness of the level of complicity and responsibility to do something, that's what became so crucial, for me, and how I just continue to think about this work going forward.
And that brings us back to your original definition of empathy, that we're all feeling this pain. Wes, thank you very much for spending more than a few minutes with us here today. This has certainly been an enjoyable exercise, and I think it's certainly been enlightening for our viewers. And so I'd like to close by thanking you once again for agreeing to speak with the people of Chautauqua, and I'm sure it will not be the last time you speak to our fellow Chautauquans.
It's
Have
absolutely
faith,
my
not
joy.
fear.
Have faith, not fear.
All
It
right.
is my joy. I look forward to see you in person soon.
Yes,
All right.
yes. Hopefully
forward to
that'll
that.
happen next year. All right, you take
right.
care.
God bless you all. Thank you.
This ends today's program, and I hope you enjoyed it. We will be back again next week, same time, same place, with another hopefully enjoyable and hopefully stimulating program. And with that, thank you very much for spending Friday afternoon with us, and hopefully next week we'll be back with live Q&A. Take care.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua institutions' full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.